So in Chapter 4, we're going to be discussing the social context of coping. Before we get started, I thought we'd talk about the biopsychosocial model, which interestingly, your book really doesn't bring up until around Chapter 8, and yet I would argue this is what we've been talking about all along, although in its individual pieces, not together. And so a lot of what we've been discussing can be understood using this model, or I suppose framework might be a better word. The biopsychosocial model takes into account how biological, social, and of course psychological factors impact our overall wellness or coping. And it says that all of these factors can influence the experience of chronic illness and disability. Sometimes psychological or social factors can even worsen the experience, or sometimes it can make it better. So what does each part mean? Well, the biological piece refers to, anything biologically impacting the individual, and this can mean a wide range of things. It can include chronic illness like diabetes. It can mean substance use like alcohol or marijuana. It can also include the medications that a person takes to, for example, manage their diabetes. The biological piece can also refer to how much sleep we get and if we get enough food to eat today. Psychological, this is referring to how we think, feel, and behave. It's our internal experiences. And social is anything in the environment that affects us, both good and bad. So, for example, work, school, family, friends, partners, children, anybody we come into contact with. So what we see is that these three areas interact with each other in a reciprocal sort of way. So, for example, if you were to ask my husband, though I prefer that you not, he would tell you that if I don't get enough to eat, so that's the biological piece, right? I can be a little irritable. That's the psychological piece. It's an emotion, irritability. And as a result, I tend to act, behavior, more snappy towards him. That's me interacting with my social world. I'm snapping at my husband. So you can see that a biological piece, not enough food, negatively impacts my mood state and results in my engaging in negative social interactions. So, thus far, we have covered many of the psychological aspects of coping in our review of the theories. Much of the remainder of the book will go into greater detail on the biological pieces of chronic illness. And Chapter 4, which is what we're talking about right now, and why the box is written in green, or highlighted in green, gives you a good influence of the social influences on coping, so the social part of the biopsychosocial model. So, I think what we're getting at here and what we'll be discussing throughout the rest of this chapter is that chronic illness and disability impact far more than just the person and is impacted by far more than just the biology of the illness. Other people in the world around the individual with the chronic illness or disability will impact how that person copes or functions with that illness. It can also even influence symptoms. And so it's going to impact the person. It's also going to impact the person's family, friends, neighbors, the community, employers, schools, any healthcare services the person interacts with, for example, their primary care provider, hospital staff. All of those people can be impacted by just one person's chronic illness or disability. So in this chapter, we've got to look at coping within a social context. So how the social context can influence, be that positive or negatively, a person's coping strategies, or even how the individual's efforts at coping can impact their social world, how it can impact their friends, their family, children, etc. So let's break it down. Social coping with chronic illness and disability means maintaining a sense of normalcy, adjusting to altered social roles, dealing with role change, managing social stigma, and maintaining a feeling of being in control. When we're talking about maintaining a sense of normalcy, this is the process in which individuals and their families cope with chronic illness. This is when the person reframes whatever, remember we talked about that earlier, so cognitively reframes whatever their circumstances are to see it as more manageable or normal. It can mean changing how a person thinks about his or her illness and disability, and also how they think about managing the symptoms of chronic illness or disability, and how we actually manage those to optimize the person's functioning. Adjusting to altered social roles. We see that chronic illness and disability impacts a person's social relationships, and these relationships tend to change substantially. Logistically speaking, at the most basic of levels, imagine if you have an illness that requires frequent and long medical visits. Your social relationships with friends and family are just going to be different. Maybe it's different because they come with you and you spend more time in a medical setting together or on the car driving somewhere. Or maybe it's going to be different because you just don't have the time to attend birthday parties, or you can't go away for the week because you need to make your medical appointments. And so just at the most logistical level, basic level, changes in social roles happen. On the other hand, you may forge more closer relationships with your medical providers than a person who only sees their medical provider once or twice a year. We also see that some people isolate themselves or withdraw from social contacts because even though they might be able, literally physically able to attend social events, they can't interact as they used to. So for example, a long time ago I had a patient who, because of prostate difficulties, quit going to family functions because he was concerned about having to leave often to go to the bathroom. So he actually withdrew from his family and friends and stayed at home, which changed his social role and his social interaction. He became more isolated. Helping a person manage their chronic illness can also be taxing on one's social support network. And oftentimes we see that while family and friends may offer support at earlier stages of chronic illness, so for example like diagnosis, often we see that only the loyalist of family and friends stay supportive during the adaptation or later phase of chronic illness. Dealing with role change can also be a challenge for the person and their loved ones. Many people with chronic illness lose social roles, or their role might change, and this can be very difficult for them to adapt to. It can also be difficult for their family to adapt to. For example, I've had patients in the past who identified strongly as domestic engineer, or stay-at-home mom is another way to put it, and they viewed their primary role as taking care of the household. When a physical illness prevented her from engaging in this role as they were used to, it was a real major challenge. Some people were able to adapt to this challenge. I've seen people adapt to this very well, but other people really struggle to adapt to functioning in their family when their long-held role is lost, and it's kind of difficult to navigate their purpose or their role in the family now. Thus, for example, a person with a chronic illness might have to give up previous roles, but they might also be able to adapt to new roles. So for example, you might not be able to go down and wash all of the laundry because you can't get down the steps of the basement to the laundry machine. But you might be able to have a new role. If folding the laundry, for example, was your partner's job, maybe your partner can go wash the laundry and you can take on the new role of folding all of the laundry. Managing social stigma. Social stigma can come in a variety of forms. It's not always overt. Sometimes it's kind of undercover. It can include getting looks from children. It can include physical avoidance from others. But then it can also include kind of less overt forms, although you might argue that they're just as bad or just as harmful, such as being unable to enter restrooms because they're not handicap accessible, or buildings, not being able to do your banking because the counter is too high and you can't reach. Wright actually identifies 3 different coping responses by individuals to stigmatizing behavior. The first he identifies is ignore. Second is overact with rage, retaliation, or hostility. Or third, use humor, which might actually involve in further self-deprecation. What do you guys think of this? Are there any other ways of managing social stigma? What about individuals who take on an advocacy role or make change in their environment, get buildings more handicap accessible, for example? Where do you think these folks fit in Wright's theories? I've actually included a little video for you guys to look at that I think also kind of gets at this managing of social stigma. Finally, maintaining a feeling of being in control. This includes the ability to control environmental intrusion while maintaining a sense of privacy. We find that the end goal being to find a balance so that the person maintains some sort of feelings of integrity. I'll actually say that one of my roles as a health psychologist is helping the healthcare team enhance a a person's feelings of control. So, for example, encouraging the healthcare provider to work with the patient to determine treatment plans, which is really a more prominent model lately than it was historically, where the doctor was all-knowing, the treatment plan was whatever he or she said it was. We do find that in most situations, the patient is considered a part of the team, and so they're involved in making treatment decisions. But again, that varies from place to place, from doc to doc. Another role that we have or that we see as challenging for people is being in a hospital situation. Often I hear my patients telling me that they feel like in an inpatient medical hospital setting, a lot is done for them, or sometimes it feels like a lot is done to them, and they feel like they have no control. So, for example, the need for vital checks in the middle of the night is often medically necessary, but can undermine the patient's sleep, and they feel like they have no control over it, and then they might get cranky, or they have trouble sleeping. They can't get back to sleep. It can have serious consequences. In addition, I often find that well-meaning medical aides will do things for my patient that undermine their feelings of control and or maybe maintaining harmful coping strategies. So, for example, in my elderly patients, doing for them can actually result in harm because they become less active and their health and cognitive abilities may begin to decline or fail. So on numerous occasions, I've had to get together my medical team to discuss increasing the person's feelings of control of their health, of their health care, in order to optimize their psychological, biological, and even emotional functioning. So, for example, is it medically safe for them to go to the bathroom themselves? Yeah, then let them do so. Let's get rid of the bedpan. If they are capable, literally, of feeding and combing their own hair, then let them do so and encourage them to do so. Can they dial their own phone? All right, then let them call their loved ones. Give them as much control and independence as possible in a hospital setting where so much is out of their control. Food's delivered to them. Vitals are done on the staff's clock because that's how it's been set out. That's how the orders have been laid out. But really involve the patient whenever possible. So for the most part, the research we've discussed, the models we've discussed up to this point, have focused on individual models of coping. The social models of coping discussed in your textbook recognize that coping needs to be viewed in the social context as part of the social process. I don't have a whole lot to add to the discussion of these models, I'm going to be honest with you. And so I'm not going to discuss them in detail, but I do encourage you to review them. Hint, hint. Nudge, nudge, especially social support as coping assistance, as this comes up pretty darn frequently, and it's going to show up a lot as we move forward.